Alex, for the introduction. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. And I appreciate Hardy Eschbaugh asking me to do this quite some time ago. Wish we could do it in person, but that's the way it goes. You may notice the title's different. I tweak these talks constantly, and I've given this several times since he heard the iteration that he asked me to give to you. So hopefully it's better and newer and improved, including the title. But the subject is in essence the same. Just a second here. There we go. Should see a bear now. You probably wonder, why is a bear in there? Just because basically they're cool. But the second to last time I gave this talk, it was in West Virginia, and an hour before the talk, as I arrived to the lodge in the Canaan Valley of West Virginia, this bear came out and just gave me this killer shot. So I threw it in advance of that talk to show them, but I like bears, and left it in. But I would point out that bears are opportunistic, and if they can eat caterpillars, which is the main focus of this talk, they'll eat anything. But this is really a bird talk. And we'll get to that, especially at the end. But you would be hard pressed to find birds that do not connect in some way, shape, or form to Lepidoptera, butterflies, but primarily moths, and mostly because of their larvae, because so many birds eat these. And even great horned owls have a loose connection. They probably wouldn't eat a caterpillar directly, but they would certainly feed on some of the birds that were raised on caterpillars. So would sapsuckers, even though they, non-songbirds like this, are not major caterpillar eaters, with some exceptions. They grab them up whenever opportunity arises. Even hummingbirds probably occasionally snap up really, really young inchworms and eat those, because as we all know, they eat a lot of insects other than nectar. But when you get into the big songbird world, the true passerines, the perching birds, caterpillars play an enormous role in this part of the world where we're at, and others too. You are hard pressed to find a songbird that really won't eat caterpillars extensively, like this white-winged crossbill, but even that would probably grab spruce budworms when the chance permits, even though they specialize on cones and conifers. But birds like indigo buntings really, really depend on caterpillars, even though that has a seed cracking bill, and it does eat a lot of vegetative material like seeds. When they have nestlings in the nest, like so many sparrows or other seed eaters, they eat caterpillars extensively. Well, this interest personally came to me a long time ago. I was working as a field botanist, which was a great time in my life, and was actively collecting a lot. So I worked for the DNR, the Division of Natural Areas, that owns all the state nature preserves, and one of our mandates was to create the state's list of rare plants, but keep tabs on all the 650 or so species of state listed rare plants in the state. So as part of that, I would do botanical surveys. And one day I found, this is probably in the early 90s, I found this Glademallow, this huge mallow of prairies and wet prairies primarily. It was a new site, so I collected a specimen, material for a specimen, which I had done myriad times. I probably have 8,000 or 9,000 sheets, I suppose, out there in institutions, herbaria, including Miami University, a lot of stuff down there from back when Mike Vincent was the curator. But anyway, when I brought the specimen back and prepared to flatten it and dry it, and press it so it could be archived, there was a caterpillar on it. And it was this. It turned out to be this. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it was on a rare plant from a rare habitat. It stood to reason that the caterpillar eating the rare plant was also rare. And I went to an entomologist that I knew, Eric Metzler. He used to work for the Department of Natural Resources, and was one of the United States great experts on moths. And I think just to humor me, Eric said, well, I'll raise that for you because we can't identify it as a larvae. The inchworms are too similar. So it worked. And one day I got a call, I don't know, a couple weeks later, and it was Eric, and he was beside himself. He said it wasn't parasitized or anything, and actually made it through the life cycle. And I have the adult, and it turns out to be this moth without a common name. It's a type of Owlette Moth caterpillar. I think it was an owlet. I'm not sure if I'm actually correct on that. But anyway, its scientific name was Bagasara galneri, and it was either the second or third record ever for this thing, and the first record for Ohio. And that made me excited. And that launched this adventure into moths and Lepidoptera. Later, I was to meet this person, David Wagner. David produced Caterpillars of Eastern North America, that book on the inset, and that came out in 98, I believe it was, or 2008, I can't remember, but it's been a while now. But that really gave us a way to put names to all these caterpillars wiggling around the landscape. Before that, it was really tough. So this was really a groundbreaking, revolutionary book by a person who's a very, very forward-thinking person. There's David in a patch of that Glademallow. I showed it many years later. I showed him this plant. He'd never seen it down by Chillicothe, Ohio. And within 5 minutes of going in there, we had, I think, 13 or 16 of those little mystery caterpillars from way back when that Dave had never seen. And he took them back to his lab at the University of Connecticut and raised them through their life cycle and really figured out the whole thing about how that species that's so rare operates. And we become good friends, and he's become a mentor to me, especially in the world of caterpillars ever since. So Ohio Flora, we have about pushing 1,850 native plants, and all of them host caterpillars, undoubtedly, even things that you wouldn't think would. The overwhelming majority of these are moths. We'll talk about that. And the other big important thing to thread through this entire talk is this is the biggest group of herbivores by a long shot in this part of the world, even more than white-tailed deer. And they are absolutely essential to natural food chains, really essential, and even to the human condition. And I'll talk a little about that. Plants that you might not even think of as like really hosting caterpillars, like spring wildflowers, fire pink, or maybe the blue-eyed grass, like this one of our most common blue-eyed grasses, this one, or even tiny little plants like the white wood sorrel, this being very rare in Ohio, but very common to our north, have little leaf mining caterpillars of the micro Lepidoptera, that the caterpillars live their entire caterpillar existence eating inside of the leaf tissue. You would never notice them. So when you add in the micro Lepidoptera, the really tiny moths, no plant gets out unscathed. Some caterpillars probably at work on it. It gets more obvious with the bigger moths. This is a fern. We have about 110 species of ferns in Ohio, one of which was just found new to the state, I think on Saturday, called the hairy lip fern in Lawrence County, Ohio. So now we have a brand new fern to Ohio, but there's about 110 ferns, and they aren't safe from caterpillars. You can see the upper pinny, or the segments on the upper right hand of this crested wood fern, have been nibbled away, and that was undoubtedly by one of the moth-eating caterpillars like this. This is a gold-spotted ghost moth. It's a big moth. It's really, really cool. During the day, the moth just hangs there on a plant, and it looks all the world like a dead leaf bit. You'd never even notice it from afar, but in its caterpillar phase, it eats ferns exclusively. Even aquatic plants host caterpillars. This is one of our native water lilies, and arguably the prettiest of all, and a fairly common thing, the fragrant water lily. And it has several caterpillars that eat it, but this is probably the most notable, the water lily borer moth. During the day, the moths, the adult moths, typically just sit out there on the lily pads, out even in fairly deep water. But as caterpillars, they eat the petiole of the stem, let's call it, of the leaves in the flower itself. They're inside of that, boring around in there, even in the deep water. So it's an aquatic moth in essence. But when we get into woody plants, then these are the ones that are really doing the heavy lifting in terms of caterpillar diversity and numbers. Varying from species to species and group to group of woody plants. This is a honey locust. Some of you might recognize that person. That's Daniel Boone. He's from Cincinnati, and he's one of the best botanists in Ohio. But Dan's leaning up against an old growth honey locust, a really big one as far as honey locusts go. And honey locust hosts a relatively small number of caterpillar species, but the ones that it does tend to be really cool. This is one of them, the eponymous named honey locust moth caterpillar. The moth is beautiful too. It's called the honey locust moth. It could win a larval beauty pageant, really a striking thing. And now this is extreme specialization. They only eat honey locust. There's a handful of others that do as well. But when we move into the oaks, there are 14 native oaks in Ohio, and they support oodles more caterpillars with numbers and diversity than honey locust or most other woody plants do. They support the most of all. A lot of us are familiar with Doug Tallamy's work in his latest book on oaks. White oak alone supports over 500 species of caterpillar, the overwhelming majority being moths, and just blizzards of caterpillars coming off those trees. That's why they're so important to songbirds that feed on them. So something like a bur oak or a white oak or a red oak, infinitesimally more caterpillars than something like a honey locust would support. A lot of those caterpillars on oaks are really amazing. I've spent a lot of time out at night, like last weekend, looking for caterpillars. And when we spot oaks, we always give them the once over because they're almost guaranteed to produce interesting things like this white blotched heterocampa, which is far more amazing looking as a caterpillar than the moth that it becomes. This is shot through this story. It's often a reversed ugly duckling tail where the larvae outshine the moths that they become in a major way often. When one gets into the softer wooded trees like maples, the diversity drops. Maples probably host in general about 50% of what oaks do, but that's still a lot of diversity and a lot of numbers. Sugar maple is really an excellent plant, by the way, to one, have in your yard for just sheer beauty, especially fall foliage, but also for the caterpillars it produces, one of which is this. Green striped maple worm, again named for maples because they're so important to its life cycle. And it's a really, really pretty caterpillar. But the moth it becomes, this is a case where the moth clearly outshines the caterpillar. It's this, just almost a shocking looking thing. This is a species that's gotten people into moths because they come out and see a rosy maple moth under their nightlight. It's bright pink and yellow, like a little Teletubby or something. And they're interested. Wow, what in the world is this? And very common in urban areas. Anywhere there's maples around, you'll get rosy maple moths most likely. But you would look at that, just as an aside here, you would look at that and you go, why in the world would something be pink and yellow? In nature, you stick out like a sore thumb. Well, this could explain it a little bit. There's a rosy maple moth in spring when the first brood comes out, and it's on red maple samaras, the fruit of red maple, and they match it. They mirror each other to a T. So it could be that maybe that is cryptic camouflage normally, and rosy maple moths, at least that first batch or brood in spring, typically hides on the pink and yellow fruit of the trees that their caterpillars ate on. Well, butterflies really steal the limelight when it comes to Lepidoptera, with understandable reasons. There's a puddle party, a big puddle party of eastern tiger swallowtails and spicebush swallowtails on a wet spot on a gravel road during the day. You can't miss them. They really stand out. They're virtually all of them are exclusive day flyers, at least for us around here, and they're easy to observe. They're often colorful. There's long been many field guides to them. Probably only birds were first, really, in terms of good field guides, then butterflies came along. So we've long had easy ways to study them, learn what they are, and they're just easy to observe. But when it comes to comparing those to moths, the other big group of Lepidoptera, they pale. Ohio's had about 140 species of butterflies. That counts the major rarities that are vagrants for us. If you really work hard in a given season and really are willing to go out and chase butterflies all over the state, you might find 170 would be reasonable in a year if you worked at it. But that's nothing compared to moths, as we'll see. That picture, by the way, that's a jopai plant with all forms of the eastern tiger swallowtail. It's a female on the top middle yellow form, a male yellow form below that, and a dark form female on the right. And they are cool when it comes to caterpillars. At least some of the butterflies are. That's the tiger swallowtail's caterpillar, which is probably a tree snake mimic. You know, they have their origins, speaking long-term evolutionarily, are in the tropics where there would be tree snakes. And that's undoubtedly, when you see that sort of disguise, we'll call it, on a caterpillar, it's for birds, visual predators like birds, to try and ward them off. When it comes to moths, though, the story is completely different and far more robust. We know that there's specimens documenting, I think, over 2,000 species of moths in Ohio alone. If you talk to microlepidopterists, they think, you know, if you could go out and find every little microlepidoptera in general, those are the really tiny things, often measured in the millimeters, like 1 to 3 millimeters, very tiny, very overlooked, very poorly studied in comparison to the larger moths. You might double that. There could be 4,000 species of moths in Ohio, all of which are producing caterpillars as part of their life cycle, the longest part of their life cycle in many cases. So it's inestimably more caterpillars being produced by moths than butterflies. This is one reason moths are so important to the food chain. So just a real quick refresher, Lepidopteran 101 or Entomology 101 on the life cycle, the perfect metamorphosis, or the 4-part life cycle of a moth or a butterfly. They start with eggs. This was on my front door, near my front door in Columbus, Ohio, a couple years ago. It's called a salt marsh moth. It's a very common little moth species. This is the female, and she had just laid all these eggs. At one time I counted them. I think it was about 650 or 700 eggs right there. So this you could term carpet bombing reproduction. A lot of eggs. And that tells you instantly one thing: the mortality rate is probably extreme. That's why they're doing it. So to get a couple of those eggs back through the entire life cycle, through the predatorial gauntlet, back to the reproductive stage, you have to do this sort of thing. So many different predators are eating your even in the egg stage, eating you, but especially the caterpillar phase, that this sort of reproduction is necessary. So anyway, we'll switch to a different species just to see this on a little bit bigger scale. These are hickory horndevil eggs, our largest caterpillar by a long shot. And these eggs are in the process of hatching. The clear one with the end eaten off, that one just got out of the egg. The dark ones, those are little tiny caterpillars coiled up and just about to bust free. And the white ones will soon be to that stage. So when they hatch, they're tiny. This is a hickory horndevil that's probably 2 to 3 millimeters long, so small that you probably wouldn't recognize it for a caterpillar with your naked eye. This was taken obviously with a macro lens. And caterpillars between molts are termed instars. And most caterpillars have 5 instars, and with us at least. Some have 7 or 8, but 5 is probably the most common number. And in between instars, they shed their skin like a snake. They molt, but they come out bigger each time they do that. That's how they grow. A huge transformation from this first instar, as we will see, to the last star. In some cases, they will increase their biomass by thousands of times. They're just little eating machines. As soon as they pop out, they start eating, or shortly after at least, and that's what they do. So here's a third instar of a hickory horndevil. And now you would see it with your naked eye, but you might not recognize it for what it is. It rests on top of the leaf in plain sight during the day, sort of coiled up like that. And it greatly mimics the fallen flowers of a walnut. which often land on the walnut leaves as well and look just about like the caterpillar. That's possibly a form of mimicry of that. Mimicry of plant parts is really, really common with caterpillars to avoid visual predators, fool them. Now we're talking. This is the penultimate instar, fourth next to last instar of a hickory horn devil. And I saw this one while I was still moving in my car in a hickory tree. They eat primarily walnuts and hickories. And it is big. No one would miss this if it was in front of their face, but it's got one more molt to go, and then it'll be the ultimate or last instar, and it's that. Now, this is the size of a hot dog. You can hear it crunching the leaves up to 10 feet away. It's really remarkable, scary remarkable if you didn't know what it was. Completely harmless. The horns actually on the top of the head, they don't sting or stick you or anything like that. Those are there to help it dig, because its next stop is pupation, and it pupates in the ground. It finds the soft soil of the right consistency and excavates a hole with those horns in part and goes in there, and that's how it overwinters, and it pupates in the ground. That's a way a lot of moths get through the winter, is in the cocoon phase or a pupa phase in the ground or on a plant as a cocoon. Then if all goes well for it, the cycle is completed and it becomes a regal moth, one of our biggest moths, the size of a bat. Beautiful thing. It's one of the silk moths, by the way, and silk moths are, to be somewhat crude about it, they're flying gonads. They don't eat, they have no functional mouth parts, they don't feed, they only live to reproduce. Find a mate, reproduce, and if it's the female, drop the eggs and they're done. All that work, the weeks going through the caterpillar phase for that, and it'll live maybe a week, if that. This is really important with moths, or butterflies too, but moths especially we're talking about here, and that's generalization versus specialization. And specialists are really, really common in this world, and this is why conservation of plant diversity is so important, among many other reasons. Here's a really good example of a generalist. Probably a lot of us have seen these. It's one of the more common silk moths, the Io moth. And Io moths eat lots of different things as caterpillars. The caterpillar is really, really cool looking too. It's very large, and I'll put a little aside in here as well. If you see a caterpillar with spines, don't touch unless you know about it, because a lot of times those are stinging spines that are protection against predators, and Ios will give you a really good sting. It'll be instant, you'll know it, and it'll feel like a mild wasp sting. It doesn't last too long. But anyway, Io moth caterpillars eat lots of things. The term for that is polyphagous, many plants. They've even been found eating corn in cornfields. I found one once on great rhododendron. If you've ever felt one of those leaves, it's like hard plastic. There it was eating it. And everything in between, probably 100 or more plants they've been found eating. That's the classic generalist moth. This, on the other hand, is a plant that hosts an extreme specialist, and one of our coolest ones of all, one I really had to work for a long time to actually see, and finally saw it last year. I'm going to share it with you. But this is sawbriar. Sometimes they're known as greenbriars or cat briars. A lot of us know this. They're very thorny, semi-vine-like plants or scrambling plants. Very common in woodland understories. Cut you to ribbons when you try and walk through them. I'm making a case here. They're actually very pretty. They're all native. There's about, of the perennial thorny ones, there's about 6 or 7 species in Ohio. And they're quite showy, but people don't like them because of the thorns, which is a pretty petty reason, in my opinion, not to like a plant. But look at that sawbriar in fall, gorgeous with the blue berries and then the red foliage. But anyway, this group hosts this. This is one of the coolest caterpillars that ever was, the curve-lined owlette. So as greenbriars grow and age, their dead leaves drop and quite frequently get tangled on the vines themselves. So that's a leaf on the left that naturally fell onto the vine and curled up and got stuck on it. And there's the caterpillar on the right. It's clearly a mimic of a dead leaf, which is probably one reason it's so hard to spot. But last year, a friend of mine found some and put me onto them. I made a trip to see them. We found actually one other one. So I got to see 2 of them last year. That's where these photos are. down in southern Ohio. But there's the caterpillar on the right, just hanging there. Here it is isolated a little better. It's got those tentacles, and that's probably just disruptive, confusing camouflage. But what we found, even if you jostle the leaf or blow a little bit onto the caterpillar, it slowly starts twisting back and forth, just like a dead leaf would on a petiole, twisting in the breeze. Really hard to see them. Only feeds on greenbrier. That's an extreme specialist. And most caterpillars tilt far more towards specialization than they do generalization. That's why all those 1,850 species of native plants are important in Ohio if you want to protect true to biodiversity. So plants don't want to be, so the way they typically fight back against caterpillars, their largest group of herbivores, are chemistry, better living through chemistry. All plants are infused with a variety of compounds. I listed 4 of them. You can read these slides yourself. I don't like to just read slides, but there's 4 big groups of compounds that in general are toxic to most caterpillars. But some caterpillar species always crack the chemical code, and they evolve the ability to assimilate these toxins. And hence, we have monarch caterpillars eating milkweeds, where very, very few caterpillars can eat milkweeds. And so it goes. That's the case with all plants, even oaks, a white oak that can, 500 species of caterpillars can feed on that, but that means a couple thousand caterpillar species cannot feed on oaks. So it's chemicals in these plants excluding much of the herbivory that might otherwise happen if they were not chemically protected. That's really, really important when thinking about botany and conservation and plants. They have these long coevolutionary histories of evolving the ability to assimilate these compounds. It's an active evolution too, with plants probably more or less constantly bettering these chemicals to better ward off the caterpillars, who in turn are better evolving the ability to assimilate those compounds. It's evolutionary warfare is what it is. But what happens, a big strike against non-native invasive plants, like down your way, arguably the worst is this amber honeysuckle, Lonicera macchii. That's what a woodland understory looks like in the springtime now in Butler County, Ohio, and Franklin County, Ohio. But there's no real coevolutionary history with this plant and our native Lepidoptera. They haven't had time to do that. So virtually no caterpillars eat that stuff. So we end up with this big vegetative dead zone. That means there's no caterpillar production to speak of going on there. That means all our both breeding and migratory songbirds that depend on caterpillars have no food there, not in the understory at least. This arguably is a larger problem due to non-native plants than just them sheerly overrunning the landscape and physically displacing things. So it is a tangled web when you get into these non-native plants and the damage that they do. I also want to say that the human condition benefits greatly from this warfare because of these plants evolving over the eons, these compounds to ward off herbivory by caterpillars. We are making tremendous use of these. Here's just a few examples of compounds in plants that are undoubtedly evolved, at least in large measure, to ward off herbivory that we've made great uses of. And the list goes on and on and on. We've managed to create some of these on our own now, or synthesize those, but originally they came straight from the tap, the plants, even rubber, tropical rubber plants. Rubber is a latex like milkweed there to gum up caterpillar mouth parts. And of course, we drive around on it now. The other thing that's worth noting big time, especially for those of us that garden with native plants, which hopefully everyone here does, and we need to spread that word, but plants benefit enormously from moth pollination services. It's far greater than butterflies on this epic scale it occurs. We just don't see it because it largely happens under cover of darkness. This is Culver's root. You can commonly buy it for your garden. It's a gorgeous plant. This was in a garden. That's why I used this shot. And there's this beautiful zebra concholotes taking nectar from it in someone's garden. Who wouldn't want that coming in? It's as pretty as any butterfly. And really, for all purposes, it is a butterfly, just a nocturnal one. So some do not nectar at day, moths, and we can see that. This is a Virginia tanuka moth, probably a lightning bug mimic. Lightning bugs have some toxic alkaloids in them. And it's on dogbane. Dogbane is one of our most important native plants, although it's derided as a kind of a weedy pest, unfortunately. And it can be aggressive, but there's a cool moth nectaring at it. And this is another example of a really, really pretty diurnal moth. The eight-spotted forester. It looks like a little black and white butterfly with orange booties. And they're commonly seen at flowers during the day. This one is not, he's just using that, it's called bucksbaum sedge, arguably our most handsome sedge. It would get my vote at least, of the 165 species of Carex sedges that we have. Biggest genus of plants in Ohio by a long shot. But I used it because I just want to make the point that not all plants need pollinators. Sedges and grasses, notable amongst them, those are two huge groups of plants, monocotyledonous plants, and their pollen is windborne. They don't need vectors to transport their pollen like a moth or a butterfly. So not all plants need insects like this, but a heck of a lot of them do, like Joe Pye probably. So these were taken, I think the few shots that follow were all taken in gardens with planted native plants. This is spotted Joe Pye weed, and it gets all kinds of stuff on it at night. Joe Pyes in general. The rule here is if it's a really good butterfly plant during the day, go out there and look at it at night and just look at the procession of moths visiting it. It'll probably really outnumber the butterflies. Anyway, this master's dart, common species, was on that. Here's a little splendid pulpita. I don't know what, I think the caterpillar is probably more splendid than the moth, but here it is on wild bergamot, which is a really good moth plant, commonly planted in gardens. But when we get into the milkweeds, yeah, as we all know, milkweeds are fantastic nectar sources for butterflies, and even more so for moths. This is one of our more uncommon milkweeds called the poke milkweed, a really big thing that can get 5, even 6 feet tall, shaded woodland edges, like shade. And here are little busks plume moths hanging on it. This plant, when I saw it, probably had up to 100 of these little moths. They are so small that in flight, they look like mosquitoes, and you might miss what they really are flying around, but there they are in close up. So you can see their little proboscis tapping into the milkweed plants and working them. This is common milkweed. You know, I should note too that common plants are really doing the heavy lifting here with pollination. Rare plants are great. I'm a botanist. I love rare plants. I love finding them. I love seeing them. But they're not really doing the heavy lifting out there. We want to keep common stuff common, plants and otherwise. And common milkweed, fortunately, is very common, and it's great for butterflies, as we all know, and it's even better for moths at night. There's a bold-feathered grass moth coming into common milkweed. Here's a little underwing on the very same plant, the same night. And here's a spotted grass moth on the very same plant, I think, that same night. So milkweeds just attract a legion of moth pollinators, all mostly during the night. But speaking of rare things, moths do play a big role in that as well. This is one of 6 federally threatened plant species in the state of Ohio. It's called the prairie fringed orchid. I'm sure some of you have seen it, Platanthera leucophea, an absolutely striking plant of wet prairies. It's really declined tremendously to get that federal threatened listing. Anyway, I knew that sphinx moths pollinated these, and in Ohio, I wanted to see firsthand which sphinx moth was visiting. So there's a site in West Central Ohio that has a nice population of the orchid, and I got permission to go into the park after dark And I took my chair. It was like a mile off the road or something. It was a long ways in, but I lugged a chair in, a big telephoto lens with a flash, and just parked myself near the biggest, most striking orchid there was when it was in peak bloom. And sure enough, shortly after nightfall, almost still twilight, all of a sudden this wraith comes in out of the darkness, this big moth, and went right to my plant and went around and just hit about every one of those flowers. There it is. The Carolina Sphinx moth. This is a really, really common sphinx moth in Ohio. Of course, a native sphinx moth, just like the orchid. That's what it is as a larvae. You probably all know it. It's called the tobacco hornworm, but it eats tomato plants, and tomato growers hate the thing and kill them by the scores. But you know, what happened here is this caterpillar is evolved with our native nightshades, and that's what it eats, and it still will eat those. But when we threw this offering of tomato plants out, when the Europeans got over here, it jumped to them and it could eat them successfully, and now we don't like them. But it's still not a trashy caterpillar or moth by any stretch of the imagination. Tomatoes, of course, are a nightshade, and it's producing a moth that goes out and pollinates that federally threatened orchid, among other things. So when we talk about caterpillars, you know, what we see most easily, the adult forms flying around, that is literally just the tip of the iceberg. The mortality rate of caterpillars is about 99% by most estimations. I'm sorry if you hear my cat too. I don't know that my video's on. I can't remember if it is or not, but I just held her up so you could see her. But if the video isn't on, you're not seeing her. But get out of here, Jasmine. That's Jasmine. She's 19 years old and likes to make herself known and wants to be part of the action. Anyway, so caterpillars would be represented by that iceberg. The adults that we easily see flying around would be represented by the above ground part of the iceberg. This really shows it well. It's a really cool diagram done by the Canadians. It's for Algonquin Provincial Park. That represents the northernmost reaches of the deciduous forests, just like we have here. So they did a comparison of biomass in the deciduous forest. The caterpillar is dwarfing everything. That's a spotted salamander on its back, because amphibians are a huge part of the forest. Chipmunk, vireo, you can see all those things. Hardly visible, hard to see at the bottom is a moose. So we would replace that with white-tailed deer here. The upshot of that is, if you quiz people, what is the biggest group of herbivores by biomass? Probably most people would think deer, understandably. But if you made a huge pile of the 600 or so thousand white-tailed deer in the state of Ohio and put them in a pile, and then somehow got all the caterpillars in like late summer, early fall, that pile would dwarf the deer pile. This is another reason this is such an important topic when thinking about conservation of our natural resources. They are the largest group of herbivores, at least in our part of the world. Because of those enormous mortality rates, that means they're a hugely important food source for many, many things, not just birds. Insects probably take far more caterpillars than birds do. And because of this constant warfare with them eating foliage, that drives this really active evolution of chemical compounds in plants, trying to thwart the herbivores that are eating them. And the upshot being, it's just that this is a critical process to higher ups on the food chain, if you will. But just intellectually and artistically, it's a beautiful world. And when one gets into the caterpillars and hunting them, and this is mostly a nighttime thing, I'll share that. But when you find something like a black spotted prominent, which is a specialist on members of the pea family, you're hooked. I mean, that is gorgeous. It's like something out of a Salvador Dali surrealist painting, but there it is to be found if you're willing to go look. There's a Promethea moth caterpillar. That's a big one. That's bigger than your thumb, but really cool, almost whimsical looking, but not as whimsical looking once you learn to look at these from all sides. That's the back end of the same caterpillar. Seuss himself couldn't come up with this stuff. It looks like a unicorn with a smiley face. So as a photographer, I mean, they're just a gold mine of subjects. Of course, there's much more important reasons, I think, to like these than making cool photographs, but that's there. That's a red humped oak or a red humped caterpillar. I mean, it's stunning. This is another case where that larvae completely outshines the moth that it becomes, which is that. Although I have to say that these Schizera, that genus, this group of moths, they are amazing because they're twig mimics. So when these moths during the day, they just settle in on a broken off snag or twig like that, and man, you cannot see them to save your life. Unlike the caterpillar, which is probably chemically protected. So it being that colorful, that's probably warning colors to things that might otherwise eat it. Hey, I'm toxic. You might want to think again, Mr. Vireo or warbler or whoever it is. This is a monkey slug, thought to be a shed tarantula skin. You would go, why? Why would it be a shed tarantula skin? A mimic? Well, one, apparently birds don't want to eat shed tarantula skins. You go, but we have no tarantulas here. This is common in Ohio. A generalist eats lots of plants. Well, this is probably anachronistic. It's an anachronistic organism because the lineage of that group of moths and the birds that would eat them, like our warblers, is very tropical. So down there, yeah, probably looking like a shed tarantula skin is a good thing. Birds might leave you alone. Now, with the ebb and flow of plant communities over the eons, these are farther north than tarantulas would be. But there's no reason for it apparently to change that camouflage. Also, they look amazingly like dead leaf tissue. And during the day, they often sit on dead leaf tissue and blend in really well. This is a crown slug, looks like something that came off of a coral reef. It's in trees near you. It's not rare at all. Pawpaw Sphinx. Pawpaw's got some pretty nasty stuff in it, toxic compounds, and does not host a lot of Lepidopteran, but the things that it does host are really cool. The zebra swallowtail is probably most notable, but amongst moths, this is the beauty queen, the Pawpaw Sphinx moth caterpillar. It's absolutely stunning. Only eats pawpaw, extreme specialist. This is more of a generalist, stinging rose caterpillar, but it's not that common, and I don't know why, but look at that. That looks like a sea slug. Well named, don't handle it, just look, don't touch, it'll sting you pretty good. Cecropia moth caterpillar, just a really big caterpillar adorned with these colorful little spines. Stunning. Everyone that sees one is amazed by it, as they're amazed by what it becomes. A Cecropia moth, a huge silk moth, and the biggest regularly occurring moth in Ohio. It's the size of a big bat. Well, these caterpillars do not want to get eaten, obviously, just speaking anthropomorphically. So they have evolved just a myriad of ways to attempt to thwart both insects, and that would be mostly wasps and flies that would prey on them, and birds especially. Lots of cool trickery, visual trickery to try and thwart birds from eating them. Well, this is a little butterfly called the silver-spotted skipper. You probably know it. And they eat peas, only peas, and especially black locusts. So during the day, they roll up in a black locust leaflet, and they try and hide. The little shelters are called bivouacs, and a lot of caterpillars do that. But caterpillars are eating machines, so the leaf matter is going in one end and constantly flowing out the other end in the form of little dry pellets called frass, F-R-A-S-S, frass. So a lot of these wasps seem to find their victims, the caterpillars, even in hiding, by chemical cues in the frass, or at least that's the theory here. So in this case, the caterpillar has what's called an anal comb. So when it releases frass from the other end, it drops it into this little anal comb, and that operates under blood pressure, hemolymph, it's really called, pressure. And the caterpillar casts the frass pellets 40 or 50 times the length of its body away from it to try and prevent these wasps from finding it. The orange spots are not eyes. Those are strictly fake eyes, pigment patches. And when you see one of these and you tap it, it'll flail the head around pretty dramatically. That's probably visual trickery directed at small songbirds to try and scare them off, basically. This is an amazing example that's very, very common in Ohio called a white-dotted prominent. It's a good-looking caterpillar. It's a fairly stout thing, too, about, I don't know, the size of your pinky or so when it's fully grown, maybe a little bit bigger, primarily eating things in the oak family, but not exclusively. But if a little songbird goes up to that, spots it, and investigates, the caterpillar is likely to rear up like that instantly. It bears its mandibles. Those aren't its eyes at all. Those are the mandibles. It bears those parts and creates a scary little face, like little eyes. And it'll sway back and forth, just like the cobra coming out of the snake handler's basket. That is undoubtedly for birds, directed at birds, visual predators like that. If the bird pushes it farther, if that isn't enough, it's hard to believe, but it wraps up in a coil and throws its head over the loop. And man, it really looks like snakes. Now, by this point, the little warbler might say, this is enough. I'll go find something else to eat. At least that's the theory as to what's going on here. And I don't know why it would be doing this other than birds. This one has an even arguably more interesting defense system. Almost a specialist on walnut trees, but not exclusively, the Walnut Sphinx. And it is a sound-making caterpillar. It gets to be a good-sized caterpillar, you know, longer than your thumb. And when it's harassed by a bird, it will violently flail itself about and shake, but at the same time, it releases air under pressure through little holes along the side of the body called spiracles. The spiracles are sort of air exchange holes. But doing so creates this really loud squeaking sound. I've heard it. You can hear it when the caterpillar's on the ground flailing around, you're standing upright. And between the flailing and the loud squeaking, that's probably enough to spook a bird off. As we all know, birds hear very well. This is really a bizarro one, and this is directed more, well, both towards birds and insects. So birds, as we know, are visual predators, and this looks like a bird dropping when it's at rest, remarkably so. From some angles, it looks very spider-like. So that's probably more geared towards birds, but those little capsules at the end, its head being on the right, as it molts, the Harris's three-spot moth caterpillar retains those old head capsules, and they're basically like really hard little football helmets. And they stick to those long hairs. And so when a little fly or wasp lands on this to try and lay his eggs on it, I'll show you more about that, I think, later, but it feels it and instantly hits the thing with those hard football helmets. There they are up close, and knocks it right off of its body. Because parasitoid insects, the flies and wasps especially, are enormous predators of caterpillars, probably far outstripping even what the birds do. This is another case of that. The gray furcula is a specialist on only members of the Salicaceae family, which is the willows and aspens and cottonwoods. And its rear prolegs are modified into what are called the anal prolegs into flails, basically. And by the way, here's on a non-inchworm caterpillar, that's how this works. The head is on the right, down on the leaf. You can see right behind that, there are 3 sets of legs. Those are called the thoracic prolegs. In the middle of the body are 4 much bigger, stouter sets of legs. Those are called the medial prolegs. And then caterpillars have 1 set of legs on the very end of the caterpillar. Those are called the anal prolegs. And in this case, they're bizarrely modified into these long whips. Same old story. Insect lands on that, it instantly whips them with those prolegs and knocks them off, or tries to. But there's many, many other defense systems caterpillars employ. We could do a whole talk on that. But the biggest way that most of them probably attempt to be being eaten, especially by birds, is just crypsis, camouflage, and they're darn good at it. This is a small-eyed sphinx caterpillar taken in autumn. I found this about this time of year. And by now, a lot of the leaf tissue is dappled with necrotic tissue, dying leaf tissue as the plants age out. And this caterpillar has that. It's green with dappled purplish blotches that match the dying leaf tissue to a remarkable degree, and during the day it just hangs there with them. Good luck spotting that. Good luck spotting that if you're a hungry Scarlet Tanner. This is one of my personal favorites, a double-toothed prominent, very much the specialist of elms. Here it is on a slippery or a red elm, and it eats American elm as well. The back of the caterpillar, the head being the upper part of the thing to your right, is the back of the caterpillar, the ridges about mirror the ridges on an oak leaf, the serrations. They're even doubled like elm serrations are, and they feed in from the edge of the leaf, and essentially they become one with the leaf. This one might do it even better. This is really, really common, eats many, many things. Here it is on black maple. Checker fringe prominent moth, head on the left, eats in from the edge of the leaf. And if you're even 5 feet away, and we were in the field, and I said, hey, Gail, where's the checker fringe prominent? It might take you 5 minutes to spot this thing. I've had that done to me. It's really, really remarkable. And that's totally a bird defense, undoubtedly. But perhaps in our neck of the woods, no one does it better than this, the camouflaged looper, a remarkably common little moth. The moth is gorgeous. It becomes a little, an emerald called the wavy lined emerald, a little green thing about the size of your thumbnail. And this is a case too, I should mention, where off many, many cases, the caterpillars go by different names than the moths that they become do. So wavy lined emerald here as an adult, camouflaged looper as a larva. And this is one of the inchworms, But there it is on Blazing Star. The head is at the top, it's on the flower, and the bottom is on the left. The little caterpillar adorns its body with flower parts each day. It redecorates its body with fresh flower parts from whatever it is it's eating. Blazing Star here, but they eat a lot of sunflowers, coneflowers, mostly things in the composite family, and really, really hard to spot them because of that. But most inchworms, and I want to talk a little about inchworms just because you could make the case that inchworms might do the heaviest lifting of all when it comes to feeding our songbirds. It's an enormous family. Most of them don't seem to be chemically toxic or protected that way. They don't have stinging spines or anything that's going to hurt anyone in general. They just are amazingly hard to spot. Crypsis to the extreme. This is a really common species, the maple spanworm. The head is up there out in space to the left. You can't see it, but there's one little silken belay line attached from the head to the twig up there. And that sort of anchors it in place. And during the day, it just sits there. They generally get on a twig that almost mirrors their body. The caterpillar even has little dappled spots on it, like the twigs often have, and it is really hard to see them. And that's how they try and avoid being eaten. They come to life at night, and this is really common. This is one of the little slugs, so-called slugmoth caterpillars, glowing green under an ultraviolet light or a black light flashlight. That's how we find so many of these. When it was discovered that a lot of caterpillars fluoresce quite brightly under UV light, now they make really good flashlights that are fairly cheap, that are bright enough that you just go out and shine those up into the foliage, and you'll get a true idea of how many caterpillars are out there, and it makes finding them a lot easier. That's how I found many, many of the things in this talk. But the reason for this hiding during the day, in whatever form they're hiding at, that's to avoid the legion of daytime predators, birds primarily, but also many predatory insects. And then they emerge under cover of nightfall, a huge hidden army of caterpillars. And that's when you have to go out and find them if you really want to be successful. This would be the Freddy Krueger of Freddy Kruegers to the caterpillar world. Good old red-eyed vireo, arguably the most common breeding songbird in our woodland habitats in Ohio. Estimated there's 1 million that seasonally invade Ohio. This is a really important thing too about conservation biology. It's not our bird. Red-eyed vireos winter way, way down in South America beyond Central America, in the tropics of Brazil and places like that. It's a seasonal invasion of millions and millions of red-eyed vireos into the eastern United States and our deciduous forests to capitalize on the seasonal bounty of caterpillars. They're caterpillar eating machines. We know enough about red-eyed vireo's life history that my estimate in that bottom line of 30 million caterpillars a day is extremely conservative. That's just red-eyed vireos, one predator out of all the things that eat caterpillars. This starts to put the epic scope and scale of caterpillar production into a light, that we can understand. If you look out at a scene like that in fall or late summer, this is Shawnee State Forest in Southern Ohio, 65,000 acres. There are so many caterpillars, or were at least in that photo in the summertime, you couldn't even begin to estimate them. It'd be like the odds of hitting the lottery or something, but then some. Huge. So when we put a moth sheet up to capture moths or detain moths temporarily to see what's out there, and you see a sheet like that, you're in a healthy ecosystem. There's going to be tons of native plant diversity, probably very little problem with non-native plants, probably not a lot of pollution, air pollution, and it's a healthy ecosystem. That's what we would want to see. That's what you see around Shawnee State Forest. But if you do that here in Columbus, Ohio, you won't see that. Or in the cornfields of Butler County, you're not going to see that. We've been too hard on our native habitats. That's why it's so important to protect habitats on an epic scale, a big scale, like the Shawnees or the Smoky Mountains, places like that. So to birds, I want to kind of finish up with birds. We're up to about 435 species now that have been recorded in Ohio. That's everything, including the rarest of the rare. But perhaps more important are the regular birds that appear here in Ohio. And there's about 180 species to 200, 180 to 200 that breed every year in Ohio. And about half of those, probably more than half, depend on wooded habitats. That makes perfect sense because prior to European settlement, Ohio was about 90 to 95% forested. So you would expect that. These are the eastern deciduous forest breeding birds that would be so important to Ohio. And nearly all of them are highly caterpillar dependent, so dependent that somehow if you removed all the caterpillars overnight, they would go extinct, undoubtedly. Very important. The migratory synchronicity of this is amazing. We all know that, the first neotropical migrants like blue-gray gnatcatchers or kinglets, the early birds, they start pouring in maybe late March, but more into April. And that syncs beautifully with the emergence of the crop of caterpillars. Little inchworms, like on that finger, that some of those overwinter as inchworms. They just freeze and thaw and they come to life and start doing their thing in spring, or are hatching out from the eggs, the overwintering eggs, things like that. But in early spring, caterpillars become widely available to little things like golden crown kinglets, one of our earlier migrants. They even overwinter, and they overwinter mostly on overwintering inchworms that they're very good at finding. But as spring progresses, the caterpillar crop grows bigger, just in size. So by late spring, you've got things like that out there. This is a meaty caterpillar, a red-washed prominent, but many, many other meaty caterpillars on the landscape. This is undoubtedly why cuckoos are so late as migrants. So we have cuckoos still moving through Ohio in early June. Late May is really common. They're late migrants. And that's because this is a big bird. It's bigger than a robin. They're waiting. They don't want little dinky inchworms like a kinglet would do well on. They want these big meaty things. They're waiting for the crop to mature. Cuckoos too are good to look at because they really throw the conservation conundrum of birds into a glaring light. These are not our birds. So both species do breed in Ohio, the yellow-billed most commonly, but these are birds of the Americas. Political boundaries are utterly artificial and have really nothing much to do with conservation other than the individual funding of states or whatever. But the birds don't care less if it's Ohio, Indiana, or Brazil. The cuckoos submerge deep into the tropics of South America, where very little is known about them, migrate through the Caribbean, the Central America, and stage this seasonal invasion all the way up into southern Canada. Truly birds of the Americas, not Ohio. But what Ohio does with our habitats to manage, just as with Brazil or Ecuador or Peru or any of those countries down there, are equally important. Rose-breasted grosbeaks. Look at that big seed cracking bill. And grosbeaks are highly vegan for much of the time, but they certainly eat tons of caterpillars as well when they come up here, especially when young are in the nest. Sparrows, they're really vegan for much of their year, but again, when there's nestlings in the nest, they're grabbing and finding caterpillars like crazy to stuff those easily assimilated bags of protein down into those chicks that need that protein. Warblers, though, warblers really bring into light caterpillar importance for bird watchers, because I would argue that warblers are easily the most favored group of songbirds, at least for us in the eastern deciduous forest region. There's a pine warbler, and pine warblers, anyone who's watched them knows that they're not nearly so flighty as, say, a parula warbler is, or a chestnut side, or one of the really active ones. They creep through the pine needles very meticulously, very carefully searching. And this is probably why there's a whole host of moth caterpillars, this being what's called a black-eyed zally, whose caterpillars are the spitting image of pine needles. It's really remarkable. They're mimics of pine needles. So even if you're a warbler with those sharp little eyes, you can't blitz through there and find these. You really got to look carefully and methodically, which is exactly what a pine warbler does. Pine warbler being one of the best named warblers because they are totally dependent on pines and the larvae like that feeds in pines. So warblers, we have 38 species, I believe it is, that breed in the eastern deciduous forest region. That's, of course, Ohio included. And then most of them winter in the tropics. Their motherland, if you will, would be the northern Central America, southern Mexico. That's probably the evolutionary origin of most warblers, and that's still where most of them return. But they radiate out through Mexico, some species the Caribbean, and all the way down into central South America. Again, it's a seasonal occupation. They aren't Ohio birds. Some do breed here, but they're birds of the Americas, with the wintering grounds and the caterpillars and plants there probably, equally important than what we grow up here in Ohio. Species like common yellowthroat, heavily caterpillar dependent, very common, of course, with us. Chestnut-sided warbler, which used to be much scarcer. Audubon in all his wanderings only saw chestnut-sided warbler one time, 5 birds. Pottstown, Pennsylvania, he shot them all, apparently, which is what he did back then. But this is one of the very few cases in the warbler world of a winter, because of they like successional habitats. So our logging of the eastern deciduous forest has benefited them because of all that edge habitat. And they're far more common today than they were in Audubon's time. Heavily caterpillar dependent. Here's one foraging in an oak sapling in Michigan. Golden wing warblers going the other way. It's become far more rare, of high conservation concern. This is a specialist on small inchworms, small caterpillars, and they're very good at picking them out of their little bivouac hiding spots with that fine pointed bill that they have. There's other reasons, though, why that is declining, and I would make the case it's not even a good species and should be lumped with the blue-winged warbler, but that's a whole nother subject. We won't go there here. The Kentucky warbler, one of our most beautiful warblers. The scientific name Formosa, that epithet means beautiful in Latin, and it certainly is. We wouldn't have them if there weren't caterpillars out there for it to feed on. The mourning warbler, known as a skulker in migration, rightfully so here in Ohio, but if you go up to northern Michigan, like I do every year, they come out of their shell and they sit out on stumps in the open and they'll sing for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, like this bird was. Wouldn't have them without caterpillars. Here's a Nashville warbler in migration at McGee Marsh, caught in the act, prying open a bivouac in a grape leaf where there was a caterpillar hiding. He pulled it out a second later. Here's in southern Ohio in April, mid-April, just after arrival, one of our first warblers to get back, a northern parula with a little inchworm that it had just plucked from a leaf and is flying off with. And unlike the pine warbler, which is well named, this is one of the worst named warblers. It should be the caterpillar eating warbler. Back when it was named, they were apparently entomological generalists, ornithologists, and everything was a worm to them, but they don't eat worms, they eat caterpillars, and we wouldn't have those as well without them. The upshot of all that is that if caterpillars suddenly had the rug pulled out from under them when we lost them all, or our forest all ended up as non-native species someday, we would lose all these birds. The forest would go silent. We wouldn't have yellow-throated warblers and cerulean warblers to look at. So in all those words that I just spent, basically all I did was go native plants, really important. They equal caterpillars, really important. And those equal songbirds, really important. And songbirds are really important in another way as well. Here's a scene you might recognize. This is the McGee Marsh Bird Trail up on Lake Erie in Lucas County, Ohio, one of the most visited spots in Eastern North America for the songbird migration in spring. And all those people and the thousands and thousands of others who go there in the spring they're probably gawking at some warblers up there, calling out warblers. That's what most people want to see. And that's great. It's fun for them. They may not know everything that we just talked about in this talk as to why those warblers are there. But one thing that's important to note about this, and I'm going to end on this, is these birds really benefit the economy of this country. You can read that slide for yourself in those various points, but I'll just make a couple big thumbnail sketches here. There are about 45 million birders. Now, these might only be backyard bird watchers, or they may be the people who went all the way up to McGee Marsh, but there's a lot of them. They all want birds. That's a given. That's a lot of people out of the 330 people in America who are doing this. They spend a lot of money. That's the other big point I want to make. 36 billion, maybe 40 billion a year. That's huge. You can see the bottom line on that slide. That's over twice Coca-Cola's worldwide gross receipts. This is enormous. Everyone should, even a politician who could care less about anything I had to say here, or anything about a warbler or bird, should think about that. That's really important for the human condition to have that. The other thing I just want to add on that is, would not it be cool if all of us, those 36 or 45 million people, or however many there are, could get together on the same page as one unified NRA type constituency? They wouldn't mess with us. They wouldn't cut all those woods down. We could protect the landscape so much better if we'd all come together, but we don't. Maybe someday, who knows, we can hope. Anyway, there we go. I hope I made my case about caterpillars and their importance. And thanks very much for tuning in.
Jim, thank you very much. That was great. We also loved hearing Jasmine pop in for a bit.
Yeah, thanks. She thanks you too.
And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box there. But we do have one for you, Jim. What's that?
Oh, should I stop sharing this? Hit that.
Yeah, you can go ahead and do that.
Okay, there we go.
And we'll walk through these questions here. One question is about, I guess you could call it the bird pandemic, if you will, but the recent death of songbirds here. And I know Ohio has recently lifted their ban on feeding. But there has been some speculation that this illness has been connected to cicadas. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. Do you think it's related to cicadas or other insects? Or
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, in a nutshell, I do. I think the bird feeding industry got a bad rap on that, and it's unfortunate, but possibly understanding in the infancy of this. But Yeah, early on, evidence started to amass about toxified cicadas, basically cicadas that were carrying over like treatments for ash. That definitely was toxifying cicadas, but all the myriad other chemicals people, in my opinion, stupidly spray on their backyard ecosystems, getting into the cicadas, the larvae transferring through into the bird community. As we all know, birds galore of just about anything that can wolf one down, eat cicadas. And the evidence seems to be growing much stronger to make that connection. I think that will come out and be pretty solid eventually. I think they're still working on it, but that's where it's all pointing right now.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see. Yeah, as soon as the science comes out on that, I'm sure we'll have a better idea of if it's just the 17-year cicadas or more the annual brood as well.
Well, my hunch would be that the annuals do a little bit. As everyone here probably knows, we have probably 14 species of annual cicadas in Ohio. So every year they're coming out, but they don't come out obviously in anywhere near the numbers that the periodics do. So when the periodics come, that just like I talked about with caterpillar reproduction, that's total boom and bust, or carpet bombing reproduction. I'm sorry, what I meant, where they have so many predators, eating so many of them, they just overwhelm the predators with sheer numbers. So the annual cicadas don't even begin to hold a candle to anything like that. So I think it's far more obvious with the periodics than it is with the annuals, but I bet it happens with those too. And hopefully someone will start looking into that as well.
Yeah, very valid point. And a good segue into that, a question here is approximately how many different caterpillars feed on ash trees, and what impact on that species has there been with the loss of so many to the emerald ash borer?
That's a wonderful question. That's a really insightful question. You could Google this up. I don't have the reference handy, but David Wagner, who I talked about early, the guy who wrote that caterpillar book, which everyone should get that, Caterpillars of Eastern North America. But Wagner did a paper, oh, it's been a few years now, where he and his co-authors documented it. I know it was well over 100 species of more mega insects like moth larvae, especially, and beetles as well. But mostly I think it was moths, over 100 species that are ash specialists. I didn't show you one, I should have, but that pawpaw sphinx I showed you, there's a similar looking caterpillar called the fawn sphinx, and it's an ash specialist. And there are many, many moths that if ash were to disappear, they would be doomed, of course. That's the problem when you hitch your train to just one engine, you know, like one species or genus of plants, and it goes south, you're in trouble. So they would probably disappear. Fortunately, I don't think we'll lose ash, and they resprout prolifically, and the ash borers won't hit them until they reach a certain size. So we have great hopes the ash borer sort of dissipate and go away, and the ash will continue on and survive. But if they don't, it's curtains probably for those species, of which there are many.
And another question here in the chat window. What can you tell us about the spread of the spotted lanternfly in Ohio?
I wish I had nothing there to report, and probably most people here are familiar with what little we know, and this is all I know, but they found it at 2 sites close together just in the last week or so on the east side of Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, and they were linked by a railroad track, which may or may not be significant. And I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think so far that's the only Ohio record, but of course they're much more common now in Pennsylvania. That direction, by the way, is where that's really nasty brown marmorated stink bug came. So I hate to be a pessimist, but you got to be a realist. I would imagine we're sort of on the same course that we had already experienced with the brown marmorated stink bug, and there's just going to be more and more. And what the fate of that is, I don't know, but it doesn't sound really good.
And a similar question, Pat has asked to comment on the armyworm increase here in Ohio.
Oh, people wouldn't like my opinion, and I'll give it anyway. But, you know, newspapers, the media, and I'm sorry, I write for one, but they make mountains out of what are relative molehills, because, you know, it sells. Let's sensationalize armyworms now. And they've done it with a number of things. They do it with caterpillars. Like every several years, the hickory tussock moth caterpillars have an outbreak because a lot of caterpillars have boom and bust years. And all these hickory tussock articles appear. They usually don't even know its name. They just call it the killer caterpillar, you know, or it'll sting you. Watch them. They don't even really sting. I've handled a million of them. But they make great hay out of that in the media. And I think that's pretty much what's going on here. The lawn care industry wouldn't care for my opinion on this, but really the main damage that armyworms, which are native, they're highly migratory, they've always done this. They say, again, boom and bust, some years not many, some years a lot, but they stage these eruptions into the north from the south. They're more of a southerner and they're migratory like birds. And they lay all these eggs, and then you get all these armyworm caterpillars. And the worst, it's our non-native crops that they find easy pickings. They can eat them. They're generalists, polyphagous, like I talked about, and they'll eat turf grass and other things, even, you know, agricultural crops. And that's what they're going for. They, to my knowledge, do no harm to the native plant community. So you could look at them in one way as a native force rising up and trying to repel the invading non-native plants. You know, I don't personally, I don't really care. Let them eat. They could come here and eat my turf grass. I'll welcome them, you know, just deal with it in some way, shape, or form. I certainly won't spray chemicals all over every square inch of everything, which is what a lot of these companies do recommend. And they make great hay over at these lawn care services. Yeah, we should spray all this stuff, you know, so you kill these off. Well, look, we just talked about cicadas. My hope is people learn from this stuff eventually, but so yeah, they're hurting our non-native plants that we grow for virtually purely aesthetic purposes, and we greatly overreact to it. That's my take on it.
And we appreciate your candid thoughts. You're among friends here, so no worries on that front.
Thank you, but I would say it to any audience, and I have, and I've been hooted at for it too. So
I believe it. A personal question here for you, Jim. I know here in Southwest Ohio, there's been a huge emphasis the last few years on planting milkweed. Programs like Milkweed for Monarchs, the local nature centers are involved. So I was surprised to hear when you said that milkweed's rather specific just for monarchs.
no,
Would it be? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't mean that at all. And if it came across that way, I apologize. I have a whole talk on milkweeds where the main point of emphasis probably is, yeah, monarchs are great. They certainly eat it, but here's the whole suite of other things that eat it. I think my point, which I probably didn't do a great job of stating clearly, is that the vast majority of caterpillars are excluded from milkweed. So the numbers of moths, just to take moth caterpillars that cannot eat milkweed, is overwhelmingly greater than the relatively handful of things that can eat it. But no, milkweed spawns this whole little ecosystem of other things. It's wonderful.
So we know that milkweed is great, but if you had to pick, let's say, 5 species that a backyard birder could plant in their pollinator garden here in Ohio, which 5 would you pick?
That's a hard question off the top of my head, but I would throw in one of the heavy lifters that is a tree, and I would either maybe an oak, maybe a cherry. There's many other options though. Black cherry is wonderful, by the way. I would throw in a shrub. That could be something like spice bush, which also spawns a lot of other things, or wafer ash, or any number of shrubs. Viburnum, that's a great example. And then I would throw in some goldenrod. 27 species of goldenrod in Ohio. Oh my God, the stuff they produce is amazing. In addition to bird seed later for tree sparrows and things like that. And I could name many others, but I only picked those three because I think more importantly than maybe 5 heavy hitter species, a way to think about it in the yard is 3-tiered layers. An overstory, which would be a tree, an understory, which would be a shrub, which I gave some examples, and then the herbaceous layer, the ground layer, like goldenrods or spring wildflowers or any number of things that are herbaceous, wilt away each year and are the ground layer. That's the important way, in my opinion, to think about gardening, even as a small yard. Get that 3 strata going. And amongst that strata, there's many options. I'll just throw something out. If you Google Midwest Native Plant Society, that's the group that puts on the big Dayton conference every summer. On there is a wonderful list of a whole host of natives in all 3 of those strata that are really good for growing caterpillars and other insects. So you'll get a lot of options there.
Great. Okay, and that was the Midwest Native Plant Society you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay, we'll go ahead and put a link to that on our website. And the final question for you here tonight, Jim. Grew up on a farm here in Ohio, and we would have woolly bear caterpillars everywhere. I mean, you almost had to watch where you walked to avoid stepping on them. And I had a neighbor that swears up and down that there's a wives' tale out there, that given the color of woolly bears, it's a good indicator on if there's going to be a severe winter or not. I'm just curious if you've ever heard that before or not.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, that's a famous one. I mean, Vermilion, Ohio, up on Lake Erie, has a woolly worm festival every year. You can go to it, and you're gonna hear that old wives' tale everywhere there and many other places. 2 things. One reason you don't see as many woolly worms as you do, which, by the way, that's the larvae of the Isabella tiger moth, a beautiful moth, but is they're extreme generalists. And they eat anything, even dandelions. So they eat low plants, herbaceous plants. So even eat grass. But chemical toxicity is undoubtedly what's reduced their numbers greatly. Just same old story here. We spray everything, and we shouldn't. But they're still very, very common. It's a complete fallacy, though, this weather predicting ability of woolly bears, and it's based on misidentifications in large measure. So woolly bear bands, they're kind of that red and then interspersed with black bands. So they go through those molts, 5 molts, like I talked about earlier. And with each molt, the bands will increase, or decrease if it's the other colored band, but it's not a hugely radical one. But by the time they reach the last stage, where people notice them as they walk around, the bands are really about the same, kind of equidistant. And what they're doing, they're misidentifying 2 other species. There's a caterpillar called a yellow bear. It's the larvae of the Virginian tiger moth. It also crawls around. These caterpillars, by the way, overwinter as caterpillars. So on a warm winter day, they'd get active and start crawling around. This is why people notice them late in the year. But anyway, the Virginian tiger moth looks really like a woolly bear, except it's all pale. So they see those. Oh, look, the woolly bear is really pale and light. It's going to be a mild winter. The caterpillar, the giant leopard moth, another really common species, it looks just like a woolly bear, but it's mostly dark. They see that crawling around and they go, oh, look, it's a woolly bear and it's all dark. It's going to be a harsh winter. That's what's going on. Misidentifications.
Yep, that makes sense, but definitely fun to think about, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't like to burst people's woolly bear bubble, but that's probably the reality of what's caused that myth to develop.
Oh, not a problem at all. Well, Jim, thank you very much. It looks like that's all the questions we have. And it's been a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for taking time this evening to chat with us and share your knowledge. And we definitely look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Jim. And perfect timing. My coffee shop is closing where I went for my internet.
All right.
Thanks
Good night.
a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for attending.